When we look at the history of change in the Lower East Side, what we see is a parallel between restricted social mobility and restricted spatial mobility. Indeed, social constructs not only arose out of degrading physical conditions, but helped perpetuate them. Mele writes, quote, "Representations of the Lower East Side not only framed the processes that created and maintained the immigrant ghetto from the mid-19th century to 1925, they were ideological expressions of them. Public notions of the inferior other suffused the operation of the slum housing economy, allowing greater leeway of exploitation to those whose economic interests were tied to construction and management of working-class tenements." End quote. We've seen that unregulated capitalism would have a segregated extremist society, the wealthiest separated from the poorest, cordoned off in their own physical spaces, with social opportunities hoarded or inherited by their descendants. We can see that these wrongs were reflected in tenement housing, what Mele calls the levels of parasitism that allowed landowners to steal from their tenants and keep them in abject poverty. We can also see them later in the development of the Lower East Side with the influx of the Puerto Rican community and the city's efforts to keep the Lower East Side an area for the lowest incomes and minority classes. Perhaps the most glaring example of restriction of space as a reflection of a social construct was the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, when the male clerks on the first two floors were able to get out of the building, while females on the higher floors, locked into their factory workspaces, jumped, burned, or suffocated to their deaths. The relationship between a suffocating built environment and a suffocating social one would be a vicious, self-perpetuating cycle had there not been change. But the change we saw in the Lower East Side was not top-down processing. Instead, each wave of restriction by government, or at certain thresholds of capitalist exploitation, was met by community-organized resistance, pockets of strength and solidarity found in these cramped conditions. The result of such community bonding and creative impulse is still seen today. In fact, it is the dominant site, with a legacy of cafes, bars, churches, and synagogues from the various groups of minorities who made their way through the Lower East Side. We saw it on the Tor, in the Forward Building, which was built at a height to rival Yarmolinsky's bank. It was the labor movement, the New York Socialist Party, the Cooper Square Committee, the Lower East Side Committee on Civil Rights, and the Lower East Side Neighborhoods Association that fought for fair working conditions and fair housing. The Robert Moses Plan that might have displaced thousands of people did not take effect for these reasons. The success of the built environment on the Lower East Side, the success of the social environment on the Lower East Side, did not arise from planning, nor did it arise from a laissez-faire, free-handed economy. Success came from community organizing and collective resistance, cultural narratives woven into a single class narrative, and vice versa.